Sotah Daf Mem Zayin is another lengthy daf. This time it has a bit of a Gadata in it. It begins with discussing a few stories from Tanakh and one from the days of Chazal. It discusses Elisha, and then it discusses Gehazi and the four Mitzrayim, and then it concludes with a discussion of Yeshua ben Prachia. Then we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses what happens in Eglah Rufa if you find their murderers. So let's begin. The Gemara has been discussing the story of Elisha and the bears. Elisha had sent bears to attack a bunch of people who were empty of any mitzvahs, and we're starting up with him. So the Gemara last line on Daf Mem Vav says, and the bears came out of the forest, and they attacked from them 42 young people, and those were Jews from Klal Yisrael. So Rav and Shmuel have a machlokas about it. One says it was a miracle, and one says it was a double miracle. The one says it was a miracle because the bears came or were created, and they hadn't been there. And the owner says that it was two miracles because there wasn't even a forest. So the forest was created and the bears came. So when asks, what do you need to have a forest for? If you're making the bears, so just bring the bears, what's the point of having a forest? So Mark explains because the bears wouldn't function properly unless they had a forest to escape to. They need to have the security of knowing that they could flee to a forest. Now the Mark quotes B'Chanina says that these 42 people who were attacked here was a reward for Balak, king of Mayev, for the 42 korbanos that he brought when he had called Bilam to curse Klal Yisrael. So Gemara asks that Rabbi Yehuda says that there's a different schar that he got for those 42 korbanos. So Rabbi Yehuda says, name of Rav, a person should always learn a Torah and do mitzvahs without the proper intent to do it Shalal Ishma, because by doing it without the proper intent, they'll end up doing it with the proper intent eventually. As you see, Bala, king of Mayev, brought 42 korbanos without proper intent, and he got schar for it. And this is our point here. What's the schar that he got? That Rus, who was the father of Shlomo HaMelech, who brought a lot of korbanos, was descended from him. So you see, he had Shlomo HaMelech, who with his korbanos was a schar for Balak with his korbanos. And he concludes, and he says that Rus was the daughter of Eglon, and Eglon was the daughter of Balak, king of Mayev. Now, where do you see that Shlomo brought a lot of korbanos? It says Elef Oilos Yal Shlomo. Now, so the Gemara answers, so the question is that we've just asked that the schar that Balak got for his korbanos was being a grandfather of Shlomo Melech, not that he had this attack. So the Gemara says that was the schar for the korbanos themselves. But he also had to have something which fulfilled his purpose. His purpose was to curse, so it had to be something which he wanted, and that was this curse that Elisha put on those individuals. Now, the Gemara refers back to the story. Before Elisha had sent the bears, he had been visiting a city where the water was bad, and he cured the water for them. So it says, the people of the city said, it's a good city, it's a good place to live, like you see, like my master sees. So the Gemara asks, if the water was so bad, why do they call it a good place? The water was bad, the earth made people lose each other. It was a tough place to live. So the Gemara answers, the rule is that the inhabitants of a place always think that their place is good. Now, Rabbi Yechon says there are three types of chayin, three types of special charm that exist. There's the charm of a place for its inhabitants, the charm of a woman for her husband. In a proper marriage, he will always think that she's beautiful. And then there's the charm of a purchase on the one who purchased it. And Mark quotes a brisa that says there are three illnesses that Elisha had. One was an illness that he got because he sent these bears. There was another illness that he got because he pushed away his servant Gehazi with two hands. The Gemara is going to bring that incident up soon. And the third was the sickness that he died from in the end, like it says, Elisha chala as chala asher yamazbay, and Elisha in the end became sick with the disease that he died from. Now the Gemara quotes the brisa, which is going to take us into the story of Gehazi. It says the person should always push away gently with his left hand, with his weaker hand, and he should draw close with his right hand. There's always a balance between showing discipline and showing favor. So it should be the stronger hand, the right hand is the one that shows the favor, and the weaker hand is the one that does the discipline. Not, says the Gemara, like Elisha, who pushed away Gehazi with both hands. Now, and not like Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachia, who pushed away one of his Talmidim, the Gemara doesn't say which, one of his Talmidim with two hands. What are these two incidents? The Gemara explains them both. Elisha had cured Naaman, who was a Syrian nobleman from his Taras, and Naaman wanted to give him reward, and he refused it, and then Gehazi went and he accepted it. It says, Vayomer Naaman hoel, Vayomer Naaman hoel kach kikarim vayifertz boy, vayaser kikarim kesef b'shnei charitim b'shnei chalifis b'gadna v'yitel l'shnei la'ora vayisu l'fanam. So he went and he tried to give him things, and Gehazi went and he accepted it. And then it says after Vayomer Elav loy So Gehazi went afterwards and said, actually, my master said he does want those things. Give a long list of things that he wants. And he took them from Naaman as a reward, even though Elisha had never sent him those things, and he intended to keep them for himself. So we're asked, did he even offer so many things? He only offered kesef and begadim. That's all that he said. It says Rav Yitzchak, in that time, Elisha was learning the Shmeina Shratim, the sugya of the 8 types of rodents that cause tumah. And here he had asked for 8 things. And then when he found out about it, he said, Russia, the time has come for you to take your upcomings for what you did. You should get schar for the 8 shratim that you learned about in this world. But then you're going to get the tzaras of Naaman is going to stick to you and your descendants forever. And this is the story of the 4 Mitzrayim. Later in the Tanakh, we have the story of 4 Mitzrayim who were outside the city. And those 4 Mitzrayim, says Rav Yechanan, they were Gehazi and his 3 sons. Now, next, the pasuk over there says that Ve'elech Isha Damascus, Isha went to Damascus. So where did he go? So Rav Yechanan said he went to return Gehazi with Tshuva, went to try to be Makar of him again. And he refused to come back. So he said, come back. So he said, I have a Kabbalah that he learned from you, that anybody who sins and draws others into sin, there is no way for him to do tshuva. Now, what was the sin? What was the tremendous sin that he did, that he caused others to sin? So he helped Yeravam. Yeravam had put an avodah zara, and he helped Yeravam make it look like there was something divine or supernatural about it. Some say that he had a magnet, and he made it float in the air, because it was drawn up by the magnet. And there are some say that he wrote a shame on something and he put it in its mouth so that it could speak, and he was saying that Kef was saying Anochi and Lo Yilcha. And some say that he pushed the Rabbanan away from Elisha, didn't allow them to ask him, like it says, that he couldn't get close to Elisha, because until then it wasn't so difficult to get there. Now that Gehazi was there, he was blocking their access. Okay, this is Elisha. Now, what was the story where Yeshua ben Prachia pushed away his Talmud? So the Gemara says that Yanai, the king, descended from the Chashmonaim, but he was a king, and he killed all the Chachamim, but his wife was the sister of Rav Shimon ben Shetach. So Rav Shimon ben Shetach was hidden by his wife. Rav Shimon ben Shetach was hidden by Yanai HaMelech's wife, and Yeshua ben Prachia went and he ran away to Alexandria, a city in Egypt. And then when things settled down, so Shimon ben Shetach sent to retrieve him. So he sent a message that said, go to Alexandria of Mitzrayim and say, my sister, my husband, is living within you, and I am here abandoned. And that was the message telling Yeshua ben Prachia to come back, because peace had been restored. So when he did come back, he stayed at a guest house, and the lady of the house who was serving the guests stood up before him. So he said, this is a good house to stay. This is a good host. They do the right things over here. So he was praising him. He said, Kamanach Sanizu, how good is this hostess? So one of his Talmidim heard, and the Talmud thought that he was saying that she's beautiful. So he commented, he said, well, her eyes are too round. So Shimon Prachia said, Russia, he said, wicked, this is what you're busy with. You're looking at another married woman. That's bad enough. But not only that, you think that that's what I'm also doing. And he put him chayrim, and he came 100 times. He came to try to be re-accepted by Rabbi Shua ben Prachia, and refused to accept him. Finally, the last time he was planning on accepting him, but when he came, it was in the middle of Kriya Shema, and he made a motion with his hand, and he felt like he was being pushed away, and he went and he set up a brick and he worshipped it. Later, Rabbi Shua ben Prachia said, go back to Tshuva. He said, no, I have a Kabbalah from you. Anybody who does an Aveira and draws others after him, there is no way for him to do Tshuva. Like he said, a Kishev, somebody who does black magic, somebody who is Mesis, who pulls others away, or Veidiach, who pushes others away, who causes Yisrael to do a sin, he has no Tshuva. Now, the Marcos Bryce says, Shimon ben Elazar says, there are 3 that you should push away with the left hand and draw with the right hand. That's the Eitzahar for Arias, a child, and a woman. That is to say that each of these is an aspect which has to be drawn close and an aspect which has to be held at bay. As far as the Yetzer Hara, she says that's referring to that one needs to have a certain amount of attraction in order for a marriage and for Peruvu to work. Now we'll begin the next Mishnah, which discusses what happens if you brought the Egla Rufa and then you found their murderer. There's no need for a murderer, for an Egla Rufa, if you know who the murderer is. So now what do? It'll also get us into some Agadat Sugyas, which are well known. So the Gemara says if you found the murderer before the actual Arufa happened, before you chopped the Egla in the back of the neck, so it's not a carbon, so it doesn't have Kedusha, so you don't have to worry about what happens with it. However, you don't use it anymore because it's not needed. So therefore it goes and it becomes regular chulin and it joins the flock without an issue. If, however, it was after it was already killed, so now it's no longer needed, but you killed it already. So the Gemara says that at the time it was killed, it was mechaper. So it did its task. At the time that it was used, it was a suffix. The suffix was cleared up later, but it still is a fully qualified Egla Rufa, and therefore it has all the halachos of an Egla Rufa. It cannot be used for anything else, and the land has to remain unworked, just like we said before. Now, even if you find him later, the suffix still has been niskaper. Now, the Mishnah continues, and it says, if you did the Egla Rufa, and then later you found the murderer, which is what we just said, so what do you do with the murderer? So he is killed just like any other murderer. If you can prove the case against him, he's found guilty, as all the halachos of a murderer apply to him. Now the Mishnah discusses what happens if you have conflicting testimony as to whether you know who the murderer is. Do you believe it or not to do the Egla Rufa? So if you have one aid that says, so this is very similar to the Mishnah we saw earlier in the Masechta about conflicting eidos about Tumah on the Sotah. So if one aid says, I saw who the killer is, and one aid says not, so it's 1 against 1. Or if you have two women against each other, 1 against 1, so they cancel each other out, and it remains a suffix, and they do the Egla Rufa procedure. If one says I saw and 2 said you did not see, they still do the Egla Rufa procedure because 1 8 is Ne'eman, and now you have 1 against 2, and the first one counts as 2 because he has a special Ne'emanas, therefore it's 2 against 2, so they still do the Egla Rufa procedure. However, if you have 2 that said we see who it is, and you have 1 that says you did not know who it is, then it's 2 against 1, and you don't do the procedure because you assume you know who it is. It's the one that the first 2 said it is. Now the Mishnah gets into why we don't do the roof anymore, why we don't do Sotah anymore, and why we don't do a number of other things. So it says because there has been an abundance of murderers today, we don't do Egla Rufa, because Egla Rufa is where you weren't clear what happened. You have murderers around, you know exactly what happened. And the Yezer ben Dinai and Tchina ben Prisha came, so they called it the son of the Ratzchon, meaning they canceled that entire procedure. Now, why don't we do Sotah anymore? So the Gemara says it's because there's an abundance of menafim, of people who behave inappropriately, and therefore this chus of the water that is meant to resolve sfeikos and restore shalom bayis, that has been removed. The Gemara says that Rechon ben Zakkai is the one who actually stopped it, and he was basing it on a pasuk in Hosea, which says, "Lo efked al bnei Sechem ki taznena." I will not pay attention to your daughters when they stray. V'al kol Sechem ki tenafena, and on your brides, meaning Hashem is not going to give us the miracle of Sotah any longer. Continuing, the Gemara says, when Yosef ben Yezer Ish Tzreda and Yossi ben Yehuda, which we would have Yossi ben Yochanan in Perkei Avos, but here it says Yossi ben Yehuda. The Bach changes it to Yossi ben Yochanan of Yerushalayim. They were the last that were Eshkelos. They were the last that knew Kol Torah Kulam. There was no Machlokes. In their days, they had the Torah in its complete form as it was given in Har Sinai, but from them began Machlokes, and there were no longer any Eshkelos, like it says in the pasuk in Micha ein eshkol lechol b'chira oisa ivsa navshi. Now, Yochanan the Kohen Gadol stopped the practice of vidui meiseres, of saying meiser of the parsha that we say when we bring the meiser sheni to Yerushalayim. He also stopped the me'irin and the neikvin. Shlomo explain what that is and why he did that. And until his days, there was hammering in Yerushalayim. The Gemara will explain that means they would have the blacksmiths would be hammering things because they were allowed to do work on Chol Moed l'tzayrach Bayid. But he stopped that because people hear the sound, they don't realize that it's a tzarech Chol Moed, and therefore it gives the impression you're allowed to do malacha on Chol Moed even if it's not. And in his days, no one had to ask about anything that was sold by an Amaretz if it was meiser or not, because he made the takana of demai that everybody must re-meiser anything that they purchase from an Amaretz. Now begin the Gemara. The Gemara wants to know what is the source that if you find the murderer after the Aglarufa, that it does not cancel the Aglarufa procedure. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk in Bamidbar, which says that you do not atone for the blood which was spilled on it. The Gemara now goes into the sugya of the witnesses to establish who the murderer is. So we'll start by looking for the source that 1-8 is believed, and then we'll get into the discussion of the three cases. The exact same sugya is repeated on Daf Lamed Aleph as far as the testimony of the witnesses who are believed to establish that a Sotah was nitba. So the Gemara says, how do you know that 1-8, one witness is believed to establish who the killer was as far as the halacha of Aglarufa is? The Gemara quotes a brisa. It says that it's not known who the killer is. That means that if there is someone who knows, even if he's at the other end of the world, that Parsha of Aglarufa doesn't apply. It only applies if it's not known. Rabbi Akiva says, how do you know if the Sanhedrin saw who it was, but they don't know who it was? They just saw, but they have no idea. No one knows who it is. It was just seen that they wouldn't do Aglarufa either. So that's because it says, V'einenu le'ro. They declare that our eyes did not see. That means that if they had seen, they would not be able to say that, and the Parsha of Aglarufa did not apply. Now, the Gemara asks, if you have nemanis then to the first 8 who comes and says who the killer is, and you have 1 against 1, how could you say that you would not believe either one of them, and therefore you have a suffix, and you should do the Aglarufa? But the first one is believed as a special nemanis from the Torah, and the second one therefore doesn't count as anything. We have a rule that Ula says anytime the Torah gives credence to one witness, he counts as 2, and therefore the one who comes later is 1. It's 1 against 2. You'd believe the 2, and you have established who the killer is. You shouldn't say that it's a suffix. So the Gemara has 2 approaches here. The Gemara says Ula says you have to change it, and it says that when it's 1 against 1, you would go with the first one who has special super edis powers, and you would not pay attention to the second one, and therefore you would not do the Arufa. And Yitzchak says that as well. Rachi disagrees, and he says, no, you read the Mishnah as we have it, and you would do the Arufa. It still remains a suffix. So the Gemara says, so then how does he explain why isn't the first one a super aid? So the Gemara says 2 approaches here. The Gemara says 1 approach and then a kasha. So the Gemara says because the only time you can make him into a super aid is if he comes first, you accept his testimony, and then he becomes a super aid, and then someone comes and contradicts him. Here we're discussing where 2 contradicting witnesses came at the same time, and therefore neither one is ever accepted, and neither one is ever established. So now the Gemara says the kasha on Reb Chi's version is because the next case in the Mishnah says clearly that if you have 1 against 2, then it's a suffix, because the second one counts as 2 and the first one counts as 2. Clearly implies that if it's 1 against 1, you would not count it as a suffix, and you would not do the arufa. So it's a kasha on Reb Chi. So Reb Chi says the kasha on you is the third case. The third case where you said that, where would you say that's not a suffix? When you have 2 against 1. 2 say that they know, and 1 say he does not know. Why do you have to have that? According to you, even if it's just 1 and 1, you would not know. You would say that it's not a suffix because you accept the testimony of the first one and not the second one. So how do you explain the third case? So it doesn't fit according to you either. So he says, therefore, I'll explain you the middle case in a different way entirely. It's talking about the sugya of Reb Nechemia. So Machakis Reb Nechemia and another unnamed Tana, what happens when the Torah gives a special nemanis to people that aren't usually neman, like where you have an Eid Echad. So Reb Nechemia says there is no parsha of nemanis anymore. No one has specific nemanis. All halachas of nemanis are off, and therefore you count all people who speak, even psuli edis. So even if you have 2 women against 1 man, or 2 men against 1 woman, or 2 women against 2 women, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. You would always go with the 2 against 1. That's Reb Nechemia's understanding of what happens when there's a special nemanis to an aid echad. The second shot is that no, now we've given the 1 aid the power of 2 aidim. And therefore, even if you have two women who come and they say edus, even if you have 100 women who come afterwards, they won't count as anything because those have the power of the two edim, and it's transferred to a lower number. It's not that the whole concept of Nemanis is canceled, but it's transferred to a lower number. So says the Gemara, what is our case here? What is the middle case where we said you have 1 against 2? So the first one who came was a woman, and you read it as follows. The Torah, we're in Reb Nechemi here, and he says that you follow the majority opinion, and therefore the first one who came is one woman, and then you had two other women who came afterwards, and we're saying that it's the same as if you had one man against two men, but if you had two women against one man, then it would count as being half and half, and then you would not go with either one, and it would be a suffix. Now, the Gemara says, why do you have to say this halacha twice? The halacha has been said before. You say it here twice. So what that is because you want to say that it's not only do you say it l'chumra, you also say it l'kula. Not only do you say it l'kula, you also say it l'chumra. The Gemara continues by referring back to the list of things which were canceled as something else became too much. And the Gemara will bring another very long list of things which caused trends which caused other things to happen. So the Gemara quotes the Brisa that says when the murderers became very many, the Agarufa stopped, because the whole point of Agarufa was in a situation where you didn't know who killed him, but now you have murders happening openly, so there's no need for Agarufa. Next it said when there was a lot of Nayafim, when there was a lot of adulterers, we didn't have the Sotah water anymore. The Gemara quotes the Brisa that says, quoting the pasuk V'nika Ishmi Oven, that the only time that the Sotah water works is if the man is clean of sin. So it's only if the man is clean of sin that the Sotah water is going to work. If the man is not clean of sin, it's not going to work. And now, of course, men aren't clean of sin, so therefore the Sotah water doesn't work. And then it goes in and quotes another pasuk and it says, the pasuk which we quoted in the Brisa. I'm not going to pay attention to your daughters when they go astray. So why do we need to bring this pasuk? So the Gemara says this to include not only that the husband has to be behaving appropriately, but also the sons and the daughters. That's what it says, b'nai seichem. Because it says now you may think that's only that they have to be behaving appropriately and not violating Isser Ishes Ish. How do you know that even if they are behaving inappropriately with an unmarried woman as well? So the Gemara brings a proof for that. It says Ki Heim Am Hazaynes Yiparedu V'Am Hagdeshes Yizavechu. Continuation of the pasuk there. Now the Gemara asks, what's the end of the pasuk? It says V'Am Lo Yavin Yilavet. The nation which does not understand will become weary. So said Rabbi Eliezer, the Navi said to Yisrael, if you are going to be careful with yourselves, the water is going to check your wives, and if not, the water is not going to work on your wives. The Gemara continues discussing things which became very many and caused other things to be canceled. It says when there was an abundance of people who enjoyed pleasurable things, then judgment got twisted and deeds became twisted because it was no longer court, because people were too open to bribes because they enjoyed having fun. And there is no pleasure in the world, the Gemara says, there's no pleasure in the world because there's no mishpat anymore. When you had an abundance of people who showed favoritism in judgment to others, then you lost the you lost the factor of not being afraid of anyone, and you lost sekiru panim b'mishpat. You shouldn't recognize anyone as opposed to others in judgment, and the yoke of Shemaim is thrown off, and instead they have the yoke of flesh and blood upon them. Next, when the lochshe lechishos became very many, that is the people who whisper to the judges, like the lawyers who can convince them to see their way of things even though it's not appropriate. So when that became very many, there was a lot of anger against Klal Yisrael, and the Shechina left, like it says B'Kerev Elokim Yishbait. Next, when there was a lot of Achrei Bitzum Libam Hailech, a pasuk in Cheskel, that people follow their hearts. When that happened, when that became abundant, then you had an abundance of the people who call good bad, and the people who call bad things good. When you had an abundance of that, you have an abundance of oy in the world. That's a reference to the pasuk in Yeshayahu, where we have hoy put together with people who call good bad and bad good. Next one, there was a lot of people who are moishchi haroik, people who stretch the spit. That's an aspect of arrogance. So then you had a lot of yihirim, you had a lot of arrogant people. And when that happened, you have less talmidim. People don't want to learn from anyone anymore. And the Torah is looking for people to learn it because no one wants to learn it anymore. When you have a lot of these arrogant people, then the Bnei Yisrael started marrying arrogant people, because our generation, the generation becomes one that only looks superficially. Someone says, is that true? But we know that someone who's arrogant is not even looked upon nicely by his own family. Like it says, Gever Yoher Lo Yinove. And Lo Yinove means even to his own neveh, even to his own family, he is not accepted. So